Hey, welcome. Eric Bach here. Welcome to the Eric Bach Show. And today we're going to break down why low carb diets are actually terrible for muscle growth and what you should do instead. So, low carb craze that has been around for a while. Everything in the fitness industry runs in cycles, and low carb, keto, carnivore, this stuff has really stuck around for a while because for a lot of people, it's a sustainable way for them to be able to eat at a calorie deficit and lose body fat. But where there are a ton of mistakes when it comes to fitness is people conflate a goal being good for one thing as being good for everything else. For example, if you have somebody who has never had a high protein diet and then they follow a carnivore diet that is low carb and they start weight training for the first time, are they going to build muscle? They will probably build some muscle because they've never been in a calorie surplus or they've never had a enough protein intake to really build substantial muscle and they're weight training for the first time. It doesn't mean it's actually good for building lean muscle. It just means they're actually starting to do the very basic things that are needed to have that be possible. And so what happens is you get a lot of people with a microphone who said, hey, you know what? Yeah, I lost fat and built muscle doing this one thing. That's because you weren't doing anything before. And so regardless, I mean, I want to give those people credit for making those shifts, but what we can't do is conflate something working for somebody for the first time as it actually being a good strategy for people who have been consistent with a goal for a long period of time. And that's really one of the biggest issues when it comes to people going lower carbohydrates for things like muscle growth. And so let me break down some of the common misconceptions about high carb versus low carb. And we'll dig into a few specifics and recommendations that you can have to build lean muscle so you can look, feel, and perform the way that you want. So let's dig into it. First and foremost, what do carbs actually do for your body? Carbs are not your enemy. Sometimes you'll see the argument people saying carbs are not crucial, whereas fats and proteins are, right? Well, here's what we have to consider. Are we living in a cave? Do we have zero activity throughout the day? No, not necessarily. And a lot of the foods that have carbohydrates are also going to have a lot of different vitamins and minerals that some people struggle to get, even with a diet full of animal-based products. And so when we think about carbohydrates, they are going to be one of the best allies that you need in order to perform at a high level, especially when it comes to building lean muscle. If we think about it in a very simple perspective, carbohydrates are the primary fuel source for training, especially higher intensity training. So if you're training with a high volume, bodybuilding style training, if you're doing a lot of high intensity training, like an exercise class, for example, carbohydrates are the best fuel for that particular type of training. Now, it doesn't mean that your body cannot create glucose from proteins or from fats, but it's incredibly inefficient. And if your body's breaking down, for example, glucose from stored muscle protein, because you don't have enough carbohydrates in your diet, what's that actually doing in your muscle? Well, it's actually breaking down muscle tissue. So just because you can get it without relying on external carbohydrates does not mean it's necessarily going to be good for your physique or for performance. And so carbohydrates, we want to make sure that we are aligning the fuel that we are taking in on a regular basis with the type of training that we are actually doing. So the higher your intensity, the higher your training volume, the more active you are throughout the day, the higher your relative carbohydrate intake should be. Of course, you still have to balance your calories when it comes to being in a surplus for muscle growth or a deficit for fat loss. But again, right here, we're talking about muscle growth. So we need to have carbohydrates specifically to fuel the type of training that is going to be best for the results we are looking for. Number two, having carbohydrates, specifically when trying to build muscle, will refill glycogen stores faster. So when we train harder, our body depletes glycogen. That is stored carbohydrates directly in your muscles. We want to be able to replenish that as quickly as possible when it comes to being able to perform again at a high level. That's exactly what carbohydrates do. Third, when we have carbohydrates, specifically after a workout, our stress levels, our cortisol levels are elevated. So when we have carbohydrates directly after a workout, carbohydrates buffer cortisol. They reduce stress. And I'm going to take this a step further. Are you stressed out? Are you somebody who doesn't get a whole lot of sleep? Do you have a stressful career? Is there a lot going on? Do you feel like stress is something that sometimes leads you into maybe self-sabotaging behaviors, binge eating at night, grabbing a drink, whatever it is? Do you stay up at night ruminating because your brain can't shut down? Carbohydrates are something that can help buffer that cortisol, body composition aside. And so I see a lot of stressed out, anxious people who are refusing to have carbohydrates and wondering why they're so stressed out. From a muscle building perspective, it's also going to help, obviously, again, regulating cortisol, which by extension of pulling that cortisol down can support a more anabolic environment within your body as a whole, leading to more muscle growth. Then carbohydrates also stimulate insulin. Insulin often gets a bad rap. People think about diabetes, so on and so forth. But insulin is one of the most, frankly, not one of the most anabolic hormone in your body, and it helps shuttle nutrients directly into your muscles. This is why people talk about having carbohydrates directly within a workout or carbohydrates directly around a workout. because around that workout itself, that's when we want to shuttle nutrients directly into those tissues to jumpstart that repair, to jumpstart that muscle building process. And so going lower carbohydrate on a bulk is like trying to build a house without actual bricks. Not going to work out too well long term. Can you do it? Sure, but it's going to be wildly inefficient in terms of maximizing muscle growth. Now, I want to dig into carbohydrates and performance. If you've ever gone lower carbohydrate for a prolonged period of time, you've probably noticed, even if you're strong in the beginning of a workout, which can happen because you actually have an increase in adrenaline because you're lower in carbohydrates, which increases stress, you might not have as much gas in the tank for power throughout that workout, right? So you might be able to hit a few top end sets, but in terms of multiple top end sets of effort, you're probably going to run out of gas. You probably also notice you have poor pumps, right? When you can't get great blood flow directly into your tissues. This becomes increasingly problematic as you're a little bit older and we're more predisposed for injuries because just of the wear and tear that happens and poor hydration that can often accompany a lower carbohydrate diet as well. You might notice lower energy, brain fog, and overall flatness in your muscles. And the reason that this is important is if we have flat muscles, we can't get a pump, we're lethargic, and we run out of gas early in a workout, how good is that workout going to be? Probably not very good, right? So when we think about it, carbohydrates are your body's stored form of carbohydrate is the primary fuel that we need for optimal training. And so if we want to be able to perform optimally in our training, which is the trigger that we need in order to build lean muscle, if we're going low carb, we are not providing our body the best fuel that it needs in order to do so. Not to mention, again, the elevated cortisol that's going to happen because we're not actually pulling that down in the backside of the workout. And what happens in a case like that, if we have elevated cortisol because we're not getting enough calories, we're not getting enough carbohydrates directly around that workout, what happens? Well, our body is going to start breaking down our lean muscle tissue to start to try to replenish that glycogen. And what we have to understand about building muscle is it's not just about muscle protein synthesis. It's the balance between how much muscle protein synthesis is going on versus how much muscle protein breakdown is going on. And so carbohydrates, what they do is they decrease the amount of muscle protein breakdown. So by extension, when we are trying to build lean muscle, yes, protein training, overall calorie intake, that is what's going to help support overall muscle protein synthesis. But carbohydrates are what helps prevent more muscle building, muscle protein breakdown from happening. Meaning it's like we're saving more money, right? So if we think about muscle protein synthesis, we're making more money, and muscle protein breakdown, we're losing more money. Well, now we're losing less money, meaning we are actually saving more. We are more profit rich when it comes to building muscle. That's a simple way to think about it. Now, on the performance side, again, carbohydrates are going to help you train harder and recover better. I mean, how important is that, right? Muscle growth comes from progressive overload. We have to get stronger. We probably have to add a little bit of volume over time. And so if we are getting stronger, spending more energy directly in these workouts because we're pushing harder with a truly aligned program, we want the best possible fuel source to be able to support that. If we don't have it, again, we can't do things like replenish our post-workout glycogen, which gets depleted specifically with these longer workouts. When we have carbohydrates coming into our body, again, that's going to improve that nutrient partitioning. It's going to help pull more nutrients directly into that cell and drive that muscle building process. It's going to help lower cortisol and support that overall testosterone balance that we want across the board. And as previously mentioned, when we have more carbohydrates, that can also improve general recovery in terms of decreasing stress levels. It can lead to better sleep. It can help support more serotonin release directly in your brain to help you recover across the board. And so if you're trying to gain size on a low carb diet, again, it's going to decrease the overall effectiveness of that workout. It's going to not support the optimal hormonal environment that you need, and it's going to lead you to compromise recovery. Now, let's dig in a little bit more. Let's talk insulin. All right. So insulin is an anabolic hormone inside of our body. Again, a lot of people think about insulin sensitivity. If they have poor insulin sensitivity, they're really going to struggle to build muscle and lose body fat. Well, we want to have good insulin sensitivity. And so when we are sensitive to insulin, because we are typically a little bit leaner and we've been eating, training, sleeping, doing all that stuff correctly, when we know how to leverage insulin at the right time, it's incredibly anabolic, right? So for example, after a workout, your body's very sensitive to insulin because it's been going through those muscular contractions on a consistent basis. What this allows it to do is shuttle nutrients like amino acids and glucose directly into your muscle cells. When this happens, we can inhibit muscle protein breakdown and we can deliver nutrients directly into those cells for better recovery. This means faster recovery, better nutrient absorption, better overall recovery from everything that we're doing. When we have higher insulin levels directly around the workout itself, before a workout, it's going to prevent muscle protein breakdown, which can happen as a result of pushing hard in the gym. And it's going to help restore, again, those glycogen stores and drive overall growth across the board. And so one way that I like to do this, particularly when focused on building muscle, I like to have at least one meal with carbohydrates before I train. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of training in the morning. If that's when you got to train, that's when you got to train. I totally get it. And so I like to have one carbohydrate containing meal before I go in the gym. When I'm in the gym, I'll typically have something like highly branched cyclic dextrin, which is a carbohydrate powder directly with either some aminos or an electrolyte supplement. Incredible pump with that combination, by the way. And then after the workout, I'll have a piece of fruit that's kind of on the back end of a workout with a shake. And then about 90 minutes later or 2 hours later, something like that, I'll have a more substantial meal, right? So point being is if you can get carbohydrates before and or during and potentially after that workout, that's going to be the best because first we prevent muscle protein breakdown by going into that workout fueled. During the workout, we have a little bit more gas in the tank because we're replenishing those carbohydrates directly as we're burning through them while going through that hard workout. And then third, because our body has improved insulin sensitivity, that's the perfect time to shuttle more nutrients directly into your body to the point where you can build muscle a little bit faster. And that's why we want to have carbohydrates directly around that workout and leverage that kind of workout, post-workout insulin sensitivity. Now, a few things and a few takeaways I want you to think about, and this really comes from the research perspective. Studies have shown that resistance training can deplete glycogen by up to 40% per session. So if you're not necessarily refueling your workouts with carbohydrates, you're kind of digging yourself into a recovery hole. It might not necessarily impact you that one workout, but it might come out later during the week. For example, last week, I had a couple sessions. I had a Thursday workout, and then Friday, I had 3 hours of filming, which for me is very active. I'm a coach, so that filming is often exercise demos. I had workouts Saturday, Sunday, and then I actually had to move my workouts up this week because I've got blood work and you don't want to train too close to your blood work on Wednesday. So I had to basically condense a week's worth of workouts into about 5 days in addition to filming. My carbohydrate requirements for that were really high. So I had to push more carbohydrates directly into my diet to keep up with that activity level, knowing that if I didn't, I would probably hit a wall. Probably would have hit a wall Saturday. Right? Would have hit a wall on Saturday. And when you start to hit that wall, your body doesn't have as much fuel directly for those workouts. Not only your performance decrease, but that's where we talk about increases in cortisol. That's where we start to see suppressions of the immune system, stuff like that. So we want to make sure that we are getting those carbohydrates in because even in a vacuum, we can look at up to a 40% decrease in terms of glycogen levels from one workout. That's pretty substantial. Research comparing low and high carb diets has consistently shown better performance for endurance and hypertrophy with higher carb intake in people who are resistance trained athletes. Now, again, people will look at like, oh, I've heard about fat adapted athletes for endurance training. That's great. If you're doing zone 1 and maybe a tad of zone 2 and you're going to go run for the next 30 hours, test it out. Let me know. But we're talking about building muscle here. So like, don't bring that low carb, high fat shit in here. It's just not going to work nearly as effectively, right? Again, fat, does it have a place? Yeah. You can use about 20 to 30% of your calories from fat, and that can help improve hormone synthesis, so on and so forth. But more than that is not going to improve performance in a meaningful way. And if it means you're suppressing carbohydrates to be able to get more fat in there, it's not really going to help you either. Right. And then finally, an analysis in the Journal of Sports Medicine found that carbohydrate availability directly influences performance, recovery, and muscle protein synthesis, especially post-workout. More or less, meaning if you want to be able to have better gains, better performance, more muscle, higher carbohydrate intake is going to be something that benefits you. Now, how can we start to structure your day so you have carbohydrates for muscle growth and you're not just glazing over every time you look at a bagel? I don't want that. You don't either. First and foremost, focus on getting higher carbohydrate meals directly around training. One simple option here is to use something like carb cycling. A very simple way to think about carb cycling is on the days that you're training, you focus a little bit more on having starches. You're getting more of your potatoes and rice, so on and so forth. And if you're focused on staying leaner, maybe pull that volume back a little bit on days when you're not training. Eat carbs daily to maintain some of your glycogen levels. I wouldn't necessarily go completely no carb, then high carb, and no carb, and then high carb. That typically is a yo-yo for a lot of people where we can start to have a lot of fluctuations in terms of cravings that even if it sounds good in theory, makes it really, really fucking hard to stick to in real life. You want to be able to adjust your intake based on activity. So the more that you're training, the more carbohydrate intake you're going to have. Again, this is where a lot of people run into issues, even on the fat loss side of things. They increase their activity so much that their cravings go through the roof and then they have no carbohydrates. Then they flatten out after 4 weeks and wonder why they feel like shit, right? Again, the more your activity level is, regardless of trying to build muscle or lose body fat, typically the higher proportion of carbohydrates you want to be able to handle. From the fat loss component, as long as you're in a calorie deficit, that can still work. Building muscle, obviously we want to be in a calorie surplus and higher carbohydrate intake to support that higher level of training that we're doing. Now, in terms of best practices, what carbs are best, which ones are worse, where people run into issues is when they eat a ton of fats and carbohydrates together, particularly like think of a dish like lasagna. Now, lasagna, absolutely delicious. Pizza, absolutely delicious. You can make room for those things. But how easy is it to have about 3,000 calories worth of lasagna or pizza? For me, pretty damn easy. So if you really want to be conscious of your body composition while you're trying to build lean muscle and you're trying to improve your carbohydrate intake, really focus on whole food, nutrients dense carbohydrates. I'm talking things like white rice, incredibly easy to digest on your gut, great high performance food. Potatoes, all variations of potatoes are great. They're incredibly satiating as well. Oats, I love overnight oats. I'll use steel cut oats. Both are a great option. Fruit, really, you can't go wrong. Fruit. Nobody got fat eating bananas and blackberries. This doesn't happen. Quinoa, farro, sourdough bread if you have an intolerance to things like gluten. Otherwise, Ezekiel bread's a great option. And even some low-fat dairy is going to have some decent carbohydrates in there for you as well. So as long as we have carbohydrates that are mostly from whole food, nutrients-dense nutrients-dense sources, that's going to be very simple. A very easy way to think about it is, foods that are plants or protein that came from the earth or they had a face at one point. That's where you want to make up the most of your diet. Now, are there some instances where lower carbohydrates might be okay? Yeah, let's be fair here. I love going low carbohydrate diets a lot of times to jumpstart a fat loss diet. But again, we're not talking about fat loss for the most part here. But the reason here is for a lot of people, if we go lower carbohydrate, it can be easier to stick to. Let's say you're on the road. Let's say you're eating around other people's meals or somebody else is preparing your food, because most people are going to use a lot more oils and stuff like that directly what they have. And so in cases where low carbs might be okay, yeah, that can be good for short-term fat loss if your intensity in training is a little bit lower, for people who are sedentary and not really moving very often, or for people who maybe have certain medical conditions, and that's recommended directly from their doctor. But overall, if you want to be somebody who's strong, who's lean, who's jacked, who can perform in the gym and out of the gym, and also has a high-stress lifestyle, then a balanced carbohydrate intake, or probably even a little bit of a higher carbohydrate intake than what you normally see, is going to be a big piece of the picture when it comes to being successful. And so ultimately, hey, low carb, high carb, all these things can work, but ultimately it comes down to what specifically do you want to accomplish? And where a lot of people run into issues is they conflate the benefits of low carb from a health or a fat loss perspective to it also being beneficial for building muscle, and it is simply not the case. Building muscle is fueled by training hard, recovering well, and eating enough, and that often means higher carbohydrates because that is the optimal fuel to help you look, feel, and perform your best if you are training the right way. Now, gang, if you're getting value directly from this and you're stuck of spinning your wheels trying to build muscle on these low carbohydrate and clean eating plans and feel like you're getting absolutely nowhere, simply DM me the word carbs over on Instagram at Bach Performance, and I'll send you a step-by-step carb cycling muscle building blueprint for free. This will simplify everything that you need to know about getting carb cycling dialed in, and by extension of that, build muscle, stay lean, and perform your best. All right. If you got value directly from this episode, please do me a favor, drop me a comment, leave us a 5-star review over on Apple or Spotify so we can continue getting this out to more people, and do so without those annoying advertisements that you would just hit 2x speed and fast forward on anyway. All right. Have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.